Over the past few decades, many studies have shown an increasing political polarization of our country. If that doesn't seem true to you, come see me later. I'll show you the data. Seems like it does. This widening gap between the left and the right has made finding a middle ground increasingly difficult. So in this presidential election season, in which our collective awareness of political polarization is heightened, I want to invite us to take a step back and consider how Unitarian Universalist values might help us in navigating this divide. Unitarian Universalism is part of what's known as the free church tradition, as opposed to, a tradition in which the bishop, for example, owns the congregation, or where you're ruled by a presbytery or group of elders. As part of the free church tradition, we believe in the importance of individuals freely choosing beliefs, ethics, community for themselves. We also live in a free country. But here's the hard part. Free individuals, it turns out, don't always freely choose to believe, to act, or associate in the ways that I might prefer, or that you might prefer, or even that we might prefer them to. Along these lines, there are ways of reading our 7 principles that are printed on the back of each week's order of service in ways that support a certain set of political beliefs. But there's another way of reading our 7 principles as protecting the rights of those with whom I, or you, or we might disagree, even amongst ourselves. The inherent worth and dignity, not of everyone who agrees with us, but the inherent worth and dignity of every single person. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, including with those with whom we disagree. Acceptance of one another, who we really are. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning without a predetermined endpoint. The right of conscience for individuals to look within themselves and discern what is right for them. The goal of world community, not a ghettoized little enclave of those with whom we agree, but a world community of peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence, not just those in our tribe. So in a hotly contested presidential election season, even as we might argue passionately for our particular respective political perspectives, our UU principles call us to respect a baseline of freedom for individuals to discern for themselves. That being said, there is a certain bias built into the free church tradition. Affirming individual freedom does tend to tilt a society toward pluralism and diversity. Because history shows us that when you allow individual liberty, now some individuals will choose to conform to tradition, to community, to authority, but many others will choose radically diverse expressions of personality. Along these lines, some people occasionally express surprise at my journey from the Southern Baptist congregation of my childhood to becoming Unitarian Universalist. And in some ways, it is a different journey than those who come from a more authoritarian tradition, that some people are fleeing authoritarianism and seeking the freedom of Unitarian Universalism. But actually, both Baptists and UUs are both part of the free church tradition. They're both comprised of individuals who freely choose to affiliate with the congregation. I wasn't baptized as a child, right? The Baptists believe in adult, what's called believer's baptism. You choose for yourself. Each given congregation that's Baptist is in turn autonomous. They also freely choose whether or not to affiliate with larger groups and networks and associations, just as we do. Indeed, the full name of the UUA is not the Unitarian Universalist Association. It's the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, who then freely choose and have chosen interdependence because we are stronger together. Growing up, I learned about what Baptists call the 4 freedoms: religious freedom, soul freedom, Bible freedom and church freedom. Religious freedom was that there should be freedom from state-sponsored or state-forced religion. Soul freedom, that individuals must choose for themselves what they believe. Now, they hope they had in mind what they wanted you to end up at, but you had the freedom. Bible freedom, that you should read and interpret Scripture for yourself. And church freedom, that individual congregations are autonomous and self-governing. It all sounds pretty UU, except that they expect conformity, right? Or you can leave. You have the freedom to leave. The door's right there. So emerging from these four freedoms, you will find many Baptist congregations that are quite theologically conservative, as well as Baptist congregations that are quite theologically liberal. Because while it's true that Jerry Falwell, Mike Huckabee, Roy Moore, Tim LaHaye, and Fred Phelps, those are all Baptists, it's also the case that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Jimmy Carter, Jesse Jackson, Bill Moyers, they're all Baptists as well. That's the kind of diversity that emerges when individual freedom and liberty are allowed, both in congregations and in society. But what happens when individual liberties and preferences conflict? For instance, many of you likely saw the front page headline last week in the Frederick News Post that read, "Transgender teen says that he and his mother were removed from cruise rally." How do we as a society adjudicate between one person's freedom to choose the bathroom that feels right to them and another person's, perhaps I would say, uninformed fear about gender-neutral bathrooms? Now, I will say parenthetically that I've used quite a few, multi-stall, this is not, hopefully this isn't TMI, gender-neutral bathrooms. I do go to the bathroom, right? And I can report, gender-neutral bathrooms, it turns out, they're just bathrooms. And in reflecting on these issues, I appreciated a story from my former colleague in the Alliance of Baptists, the Reverend Dr. Amy Butler, who's now a minister at the Riverside Church in New York City. On a recent return flight from Europe, Amy found herself in the midst of a conflict around differing interpretations of religious freedom and of individual liberty. As she approached the seat listed on her ticket, she noticed that all around her in the aisles around her seat were men that were identically dressed, and she presumed, being the religion professional that she is, they must be part of some Orthodox religious group. It turns out she guessed correctly, because as soon as she sat down, the man beside her pressed the flight attendant button and said to the flight attendant, "She will need to be moved. My religious freedom is being violated. My religion does not allow me to sit next to a woman who is not my wife." Now, Amy confesses, "I had so many thoughts at that moment." Because she doesn't know anything about religious discrimination as a female Baptist minister, right? She did not give up her seat, but the conflict was also just beginning. There were other perceived violations of religious freedom on the airline food not passing theological muster, the men not feeling religiously prohibited from interacting with female flight attendants. She writes, "The end result was a noisy, contentious, and anxiety-ridden 8 hours." So how do we move forward? Is there an unresolvable impasse between a woman's freedom to sit in her assigned seat and a religiously orthodox man's conviction that the God of his understanding forbids him from sitting next to a woman who is not his wife? How do we solve the dilemma of one person's perceived religious freedom to sell wedding cakes only to opposite-sex couples, or another person's desired religious liberty to maintain traditional gender roles in bathrooms? One frequently missing insight in these debates is that religious liberty, I would say at least rightly understood, the freedom, you might say, to choose your own religion without coercion by government, religious leaders, the larger community, that individual religious liberty does not extend to unduly controlling other people. Sometimes I think that we in the United States have become so far removed for what it actually feels like to not have religious freedom, to live in a society in which you are forced to be part of a state-sponsored religion under threat of imprisonment or death, like the Inquisition, for example, that we have forgotten how precious and hard-won individual religious freedom is. But that individual freedom of religion does not give individuals power to impose their religion on others. I respect, though disagree, if the God of your understanding tells you not to use contraception. But your employees' access to birth control is not yours to control. To use the language of our Constitution, the First Amendment has both a free exercise clause and an anti-establishment clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So while you do have freedom of religion, that individual freedom of religion does not include the right to establish your religion over others. That would be one step too far. As our Unitarian forebear and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "The right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins." Or as Reverend Amy said, reflecting on her airplane encounter, religious freedom is just that, freedom. Note that we don't call it religious comfort. In other words, the onus is on you to make the accommodations or other people within reason, but you can't force the accommodations on to other people. When we forget this insight, claims about religious liberty too often end up masking what in reality is an attempt to force an individual or group's sexism, racism, or homophobia on the larger society. To be clear, in a free society, individuals can and do freely choose sexist, racist, homophobic beliefs, both consciously and unconsciously. However, a commitment to individual liberty requires limits on how individuals interact with one another. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can punish a man for trying to lynch me." And I don't mean to be flippant when I say that simply keeping us from killing one another and then allowing us to live freely amidst all of our diversity is a tremendous catalyst for progress. As Dr. King said later in the same speech, one of the tragedies of our whole struggle is monologue rather than dialogue. And I am convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. And they fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they don't communicate with one another. And they don't communicate with one another because they are separated from one another. This dynamic remains true today. So many people have become less sexist, not by abstract arguments, but through a relationship with their daughter, their mother, their spouse, or their loved one who was suddenly they found being discriminated against simply because of the sex of their birth. Likewise, the struggle for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender justice has been advanced less by reasoned arguments, they've been a part too, than by people experiencing loved ones coming out of the closet and seeing that LGBT folk are not them, but us. Even in the face of our increasingly polarized country, there is a broader trend of expanding concentric circles about who is us. Who is a fellow human being? Who is included as fully enfranchised and represented as a member of we, the people? Almost 60 years ago, when then Senator John F. Kennedy was running for president, he had to give a major speech, it turns out, to Baptist ministers in Houston to convince the U.S. public that a Roman Catholic could be president without being unduly influenced by the Pope. This was a big deal. Today, to use another branch of government to show how far our culture has shifted and to include a larger circle, there are 5 Roman Catholic members of the Supreme Court. There used to be 6 prior to the recent death of Antonin Scalia. 3 Jewish members, maybe soon to be a 4th, we'll see, and no Protestants. Similarly, despite major persecutions historically against Mormons in our society, in our nation's history, in the last presidential election, Governor Mitt Romney had white evangelicals voting for him in even greater numbers than had voted for George W. Bush 4 years later. Romney may have lost, but Mormons won. When I was young and my worldview was formed almost exclusively from a Southern Baptist perspective, I would have been happy to learn that all 6 billion people on earth had been convinced overnight to become Southern Baptists. But as I grew older, I began to meet increasing numbers of non-Southern Baptists who, funnily enough, turned out to be kind, well-adjusted, smart, funny, competent human beings. And when your roommate is Roman Catholic, your best friend is an atheist, and your favorite professor is a Buddhist, it's increasingly difficult to maintain with integrity the position that any single belief system is the only or one best way of being in the world. This conviction does not make me a relativist. I don't believe that just anything is good or permissible, but I am a pluralist. I do believe there is more than one legitimate, healthy way of being in the world. It's why we UUs have 6 sources, not just one, that form our living tradition. So in this presidential election season, be passionate about your convictions. With UUs, I don't really have to worry about that. You're going to be fine. But be mindful of the difference between brutal honesty and speaking the truth as you understand it today in love. Amidst a political process that often cynically pits neighbor against neighbor, let us continue to be the ones contributing to building the beloved community. For now, I'd like to leave you with these words from Diana Eck. She's a professor of comparative religion at Harvard University who, for many years, starting back in 1991, directed what was known as the Pluralism Project. It helped document previously unreported religious diversity all across our country. So they sent students from Harvard, recruited students from all over the country, including from Furman, where I was a religion major, to go out into their local communities and just discover that, wait, there's a Hindu temple here? Wait, there's a Sikh Gurdwara here? Just find out just how much religious diversity there was in almost every rural town and community. So Dr. Eck shared these words coming out of what she had learned, and she shared these in a sermon at the Unitarian Church of All Souls in New York City back in 2007, but they remain relevant today for the role that we UUs might play amidst our politically polarized society. Eck said, "The world has need of your theology. If there ever were a time that we needed to spin out a new fabric of belonging and a wider sense of we for the human community, it is certainly now. In a world divided by race, religion, and ideology, the very presence of a religious movement like yours, like ours, committed to the love of neighbor and to the service of humanity, it's a beacon. The Unitarian Universalist theology, and yes, you have one, she said, does not reduce the mystery of the divine, the transcendent, but amplifies it, broadens it, to include the many, many ways that the divine is known and yet unknown. Developing a consciousness of our growing religious interrelatedness, developing a moral compass to give us guidance in the years ahead, these are among the most important tasks of our time. You have the theological orientation toward oneness and mystery. That is essential for the world of religious difference in which we live. In this era, Unitarian Universalism is not the lowest common denominator. It is one of the highest common callings. In that spirit, I invite you to rise in body or spirit, to sing together hymn 1017, Building a New Way.